appreciate and feel gratitude for this land and for the space that we have for each other. And I want to read the land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge the territory in which we gather as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk and the island of Newfoundland as the ancestral homelands of the Mi'kmaq and Beothuk. We would also like to recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Nunatukavut and the Innu of Disinan and their ancestors as the original people of Labrador. We strive for respectful relationships with all the peoples of this province as we search for collective healing and true reconciliation and honor this beautiful land together. So the speaker today is Dr. Daniel Kudla, and he is an assistant professor in the sociology department at Memorial University. And thank you to some of the sociology people who have joined us today. We're very grateful that you're here. So he is an urban sociologist, criminologist, and social theorist who studies social control, policing, urban marginality, and poverty governance. His recent work focuses on the role of business improvement areas in the planning, organization, and control of contemporary urban space. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Daniel Kudla.
Thank you very much. So thanks for the kind introduction. So the title of my presentation today is Exploring Business-Led Poverty Governance in Toronto and Winnipeg, Post-Revanchist Approach, ? You might be thinking, why is a sociologist giving this talk for geography speaker series? Well, I do assure you, I do sort of overlap and do some interdisciplinary work with human geography, criminology, sociology, of course, and more specifically, I do so to understand this intersection, as you just mentioned, between urban space, social control, and marginalized groups. So the work that I'm actually presenting today combines this area, but more specifically to examine these new strategies that I've noticed enacted by business districts, so these coalitions of businesses in mostly urban centers, that manage visible poverty. So this is different than some of the punitive responses that have been relied upon in the past, traditionally by business organizations. So what I present to you today is more so my conceptual work that I've done to justify and situate my study. I have yet to do any data collection, although I do share some basic information that I've gained from publicly accessible documents about these two specific programs, which I'll exemplify throughout the presentation today. And I'm very much interested to hear your feedback, constructive criticism on how I can strengthen this project, as I'm very much in the early stages of this work right now. So my empirical focus, as I'll talk about in more detail, is on these two very interesting, what I'm calling business-led poverty governance models in Toronto and Winnipeg. Specifically, they are run and enacted by the Downtown Yonge Business Improvement Area, which is the area just out front of Dundas Square. For those of you that have been visiting Toronto in the past, you might be familiar with that area. It surrounds that area and it's sort of the larger geographical boundary where a lot of businesses are. The second one that I'll focus on, or that I want to focus on for this study, is the Downtown Winnipeg Business Improvement Zone. They use zone instead of area, but it's the same sort of coalition of businesses. And both of these, I'm finding, are enacting these kind of different models of managing visible poverty, like I said, different from what businesses have done in the past. So generally speaking, or maybe I should start with my interest in this before I talk about the content on the slide here. But during my master's, I was very much interested in these business improvement areas, specifically how, again, they manage and control urban spaces. And I kind of continued this work throughout my doctoral work and still doing so, obviously, right now. But specifically, I was interested in how they manage visible poverty outside of their storefronts. How do these businesses manage it? What are their viewpoints, attitudes towards this? And when I say visible poverty, I'm referring to sort of a range of marginalized street populations, such as people experiencing homelessness, maybe panhandlers that aren't necessarily homeless, but are on the streets, drug users, prostitutes, or just generally street-involved people who may or may not use local shelters. Essentially, they're just visible in public spaces, and according to businesses, are urban disorder, are reflective of urban disorder and a nuisance. So as you can imagine, and as you see on slides here, businesses generally have these very antagonistic, hostile relationships with the presence of visible poverty. And now this is me just selecting various articles over the past just 6 months for the most part. And they generally are antagonistic and hostile towards marginalized groups because the presence of visible poverty detracts from the marketability of the area, it scares away customers, it lowers property values, so hence this is why they're very much hostile towards people experiencing homelessness outside of the storefronts. But at the same time, of course, visible poverty and homelessness has been rising since the pandemic, has become more visible. People experiencing homelessness increasingly have no place to go. Shelter systems are unfortunately full. Some are considered shelter resistant. Housing first models, which have become very dominant in the Canadian context, are very slow to rapidly connect people to housing. So what we're left with is, in many cities across Canada, sort of like encampments happening in mid-sized to large cities, and just sort of the visible presence of visible poverty on sidewalks, streets, etc. So it is sort of a growing social problem, to be sure. And we're seeing these tensions between businesses and marginalized groups, to the extent, as you see from the slides and sort of these media portrayals, that businesses, of course, up top here in Toronto, sort of have this NIMBYism towards homeless shelters, mid-sized city Moncton here, looking for solutions for growing homeless problems, business improvement area at wit's end, quote unquote, over the downtown vagrants. Encampments happening in recently very aggressive standoff between police and homeless advocates in Halifax. And businesses, of course, are sort of involved in these complaints about the encampments. More standoffs in Edmonton, as you see here with these encampments. Fredericton as well, very recently. So we're seeing this happening in recent years across many different Canadian cities. And generally speaking, like I said, businesses have had this very hostile approach and viewpoint on visible poverty. And it led to a lot of these tense encounters between business owners and those on the streets. Usually leading to businesses, seeking solutions from city councils to deal with the problem, usually in the form of criminalizing homelessness, evicting encampments, displacing the homeless, which has harsh consequences and implications on people experiencing homelessness. So as you see, this is kind of happening across Canada. However, what I kind of grew, what caught my attention during my doctoral work as I was finishing my work a few years ago, I began to notice a very slight shift in business improvement areas' response to visible poverty and managing visible poverty. So it was actually this particular article by the Globe and Mail that caught my attention back in 2017, as you see, titled, How Canada's Opioid Crisis is Turning Business Owners into Advocates. So this article in particular talked about how businesses in, I believe this was Vancouver, were asking the government not to criminalize homelessness, but to actually support them and bring them some sort of social supports, to the extent that these business owners were now taking it onto themselves to train their employees to use naloxone kits at the beginning of this fentanyl crisis, sort of in the 2015 era and on. So over the years, I noticed more and more of these stories and portrayals of businesses having this more, I guess, supportive, accommodative response to homelessness. Here's an example from Brantford, Ontario, and a lot of these examples are from Ontario because that's where I'm originally from. So Brantford was working with outreach workers to make contacts with people on the streets in the downtown area. Hamilton, Barton Village has this mental health coordination or collaboration with mental health services, where they collaborate with nurses, peer support workers, mental health workers. Woodstock, small city outside of my hometown of London, Ontario. Businesses acknowledging that we can't police the problem, police out of this problem, and they're kind of starting their own homeless response as a result. Another example from Ottawa, a lot of BIA leaders, the business improvement area leaders, are acknowledging the issues around mental health, substance abuse, to the extent where, as I'll talk about in more detail, the Downtown Young BIA in Toronto trains their employees and business owners on de-escalation tactics and sort of the complexities around homelessness and mental health issues and addiction. So I was kind of attuned to this process happening, and I was very much just more interested in, first off, finishing my doctoral work and starting to investigate this sort of business-led poverty governance model that's very much different from the traditional punitive responses that businesses generally, stereotypically have. So I coined this, like I said, this process of business-led poverty governance because it very much is led by the business organizations. They're not just seeking to necessarily criminalize and evict, seemingly. So my research question is very exploratory in that I just simply want to understand how do these governance models actually operate. So it's, again, very exploratory, mainly because there's not a lot of research acknowledging or highlighting the emergence of this model. So I, therefore, think it's important to examine the role and impact these strategies are having on local poverty. And I focus specifically on two programs, these kind of prepackaged programs, like I said, by Downtown Yonge Business Improvement Area. Again, sort of the Dundas Square central area of this boundary, but the boundary's a little bit larger. So they're enacting what they coined the Safe and Inclusive Streets strategy. And in Toronto, you know, the numbers, it's hard to pinpoint exactly the numbers of people experiencing homelessness, but a rough estimate is about 9,000 homeless individuals in Toronto. A couple hundred have been counted through point in time counts in the Dundas Square area. And in Winnipeg, like I said, the Downtown Winnipeg Business Improvement Zone is employing this downtown community safety partnership. It basically encompasses all of Winnipeg's downtown, just south of the Exchange District, for anybody that's familiar with the area. Homelessness in that area is about 1,500 in the city at large, and there are a couple hundred through point in time counts in the downtown area. So very quick rundown of what I'll discuss for the next, I guess, 25, 30 minutes. First, I want to just get into what business improvement areas actually are, give you some context for these organizations, how they emerge, what they do, a very quick rundown. I then want to explore some of the literature rooted, some BIA literature, excuse me, which is very much rooted in the idea of the neoliberal punitive term paradigm, which sees BIAs as part of sort of this punitive response to homelessness. So this was what a lot of the early research was focused upon. But I do want to contrast that with some emerging research on BIA literature that's offering some different conceptualizations of the punitive term and seeing neoliberalism not necessarily as a singular, powerful structure, but rather sort of this nuanced, differentiated form of power, which I'll talk about in more detail. I then want to situate, rather than seeing BIAs through this punitive term paradigm, I want to situate them as actors in this growing research on poverty governance. So I want to make this sort of theoretical connection between these organizations and the growing idea of poverty governance. I'll then describe very briefly my two case studies. As I said, I don't have any data yet. I'm planning to do this work next year. And I will present some research objectives and some basic methodology that I plan to use for this study. And I do have some concluding thoughts, and I'm very much looking forward to any questions, criticisms, complaints, compliments that you have about my research. Okay, so what are business improvement areas? So they're commonly called business improvement districts in the United States. In Canada, this is the conventional name for them. And they have various different naming conventions around the world. So in Canada, there are about 300 business improvement areas across the country. In the States, there are over 1,000 of these organizations, and even more so across the world, as I mentioned. They actually originated in Toronto, in Bloor West Village, back in 1970, but they didn't really expand until the 1990s. So essentially, what these organizations are is the municipal government basically gives local property and business owners within a very specific boundary. They give them the legal authority to make changes to the aesthetic and intricate aspects of urban spaces outside of their storefronts. So things like sidewalks, streets, gardens, street furniture, and so on. Now they're actually legally governed by the municipal government, which allows these businesses to secure financial contributions from each individual businesses, which is then funded towards revitalization projects. So basically, there's an additional tax that these businesses agree to pay. That tax, that money is then transferred to the city, then the city transfers that back to the BIA for them to use as they see fit. So in particular, they provide three main services that has been acknowledged in the academic literature. First and foremost, number one is physical improvements. They do ongoing maintenance like garbage collection, street cleanup, graffiti removal, landscaping, that sort of stuff. Marketing, advertising, branding, producing maps, banners, logos, such as this downtown Young logo, for instance, which you may then see banners of throughout the streets. So basically, when you see these types of branded spaces, you're essentially walking into a business improvement area. And the one that I'll emphasize in more detail today, of course, is the security aspect. So many of these BIAs fund or pay for security infrastructure like CCTV surveillance cameras, private security patrols. Increasingly, a lot of them are relying on what are called tourism and hospitality ambassadors. So they're sort of these walking information kiosks, if you will, that talk to customers, but yet they have this security role, which is very interesting. And they also partner with the police, and that's part of their security function as well. And then lastly, sort of to the point of the picture at the top right there, lobbying is a big part of what they do. So a big part of what they do is to try to persuade city governments to enact their business-backed interests, to enact certain bylaws, to fund the revitalization projects that they're seeking to invest in. So lobbying is really a big aspect of what they do, for sure. So in other words, these are public-private organizations that are comprised of private businesses, but yet they're sanctioned by the local government. And it basically allows the private sector to make decisions on the public spaces outside of their storefronts. So there has been a lot said about BIAs, mainly through a critical urban theorists have definitely written about this since the mid-1990s, early 2000s. And mainly, the view is that BIAs are a reflection of a neoliberal urbanism, essentially. So much of the work, like I said, is rooted in this sort of framework, especially the early work. So the view here was that BIAs emerged as a result of the local state's failure to adequately revitalize and invest in the public sphere or public spaces in sort of the post-industrial era, 1970s era and on. So the view here is that now private businesses are supplementing public services through their own privately paid services. So essentially the local government has tasked a coalition of business elite to manage urban spaces and enhance the flow of capital through specific localities. So this is, again, part of the sort of neoliberal framework. And the view is that BIAs simply treat spaces as a marketable commodity in order to compete in a global urban market, in order to attract tourists, investors, visitors, and so on. So the view here, especially influenced by the work of David Harvey, a lot of critical urban theorists argue that cities now care less about providing, protecting rights and social welfare of its citizens, but rather are now more interested in enacting these entrepreneurial strategies that seek to simply stimulate the local economy at the expense of any marginalized groups that might be in that BIA space. More specifically, however, under this neoliberal framework, BIAs have been conceptualized as part of this punitive turn paradigm, which dominated a lot of urban sociology and geography in the 1990s and early 2000s. So the view is that this dominant neoliberal approach to managing urban spaces is conditioned or dependent on exclusion, displacement, and punishment of the homeless. And we had very classic works in this regard, such as Mike Davis's Carceral City, which argued, using Los Angeles as a case study, that we're creating fortress-like cities through policing tactics and hardening of urban architecture in order to exclude the homeless from these spaces. We had Mitchell in 1997 talking about, we're seeing now the emergence of a post-justice city we're now, in an effort to bring in global capital, we're now creating anti-homeless bylaws in order to exclude and annihilate the homeless from these spaces. And then lastly, and which is rooted in, and this is the word I borrow for the title of my presentation, the Revanchist City by Neil Smith, who wrote a very popular book on explaining the role of gentrification and how the white upper class is now seeking revenge against the urban poor who have invaded downtown spaces, and hence gentrification and these larger processes of urban renewal are just indicators of this revenge against the poor in these downtown spaces. So we have these sorts of conceptualizations, and very much so BIA studies, early BIA studies in the 2000s were reflective of this punitive turn paradigm. So for instance, Sharon Zukin's classic work on the culture of cities argued that BIAs are reflective of the Disneyfication of cities, or of urban spaces, where a private organization is now taking control of urban spaces in order to create stability and security at the expense of anyone deemed undesirable. We have work that looks at broken windows policing and how BIAs are simply these mechanisms through which the police are now enacting broken windows policing tactics by criminalizing mundane, low-level crimes like loitering, sleeping, public urinating, public drinking. So these behaviors associated with homelessness are just basically criminalized. And then we have an interesting work by Laura Huey and colleagues arguing that BIAs are reflective of policing fantasy city, which is a form of image-oriented policing that attempts to create spaces conducive to consumption activity at the expense of marginalized groups that are just simply excluded from these spaces in order to hide and mask homelessness. So this sort of view in early BIA literature was very much rooted in these sorts of conceptualizations. And a lot of my work has very much followed this framework. So for instance, like I said, I was very much interested in BIA since my master's work. And my early work back in 2013, my master's, which I then published as an article later on, argued that BIAs seek to construct notions of urban authenticity, and by doing so, this then displaces or gives justification for displacing anything that's deemed inauthentic, such as undesirable groups, like visible poverty, those homeless on the streets. I then also worked with a colleague of mine, Mike Curry, looked at, my doctoral work, I should emphasize, more specifically looked at the justification process that BIAs, the justifications that BIAs use to justify things like gentrification and government funding. So we argued that they purposefully stigmatize their areas to justify these things. And also, I have a recent paper on how BIAs simply lobby local government, against provisions of affordable housing. So this was also rooted out of my doctoral work that focused on the justification process, specifically in London, Ontario, on two BIAs, the downtown London BIA and a smaller BIA, the Old East Village. So my work was very much rooted in this punitive turn sort of neoliberal framework. However, as I move forward to think about these new poverty governance models, I'm very much more interested in rethinking neoliberal urbanism. So my prior work, like I said, was very much reflected in this, but now I'm sort of turning more into some theories that are emphasizing a more nuanced, differentiated, and less punitive modality of governance. So there's some work emerging in terms of rethinking how neoliberalism operates on the ground. So there's more of an emphasis on these sort of place-based investigations of neoliberalism rather than just assuming there's sort of the singular neoliberalism that is employed in spaces universally the same way. So there's some interesting BIA studies that argue that we need to look at these place-based investigations in order to understand these lower level logics that they employ. So Lippert out of Windsor deemed and coined the term clean and safe logic that BIAs employ. Walby and Heyer did some interesting work documenting the fact that some BIAs are actually resistant to implementing CCTV surveillance cameras in their spaces. So they found, I think they did a comparison between 3 or 4 cities across Canada, and they found that some are very much looking forward and supporting CCTV surveillance, whereas others are very much reluctant and opposed to it. So it sort of demonstrates the variability of neoliberal governance here. And then lastly, some global work in South Africa and Ghana found that there's a reluctance in some of these organizations in some cities to actually engage in any form of social control, insofar as sanitation workers are dispossessing the homeless's property in a lot of these encampments that exist. So this is sort of a new form of social control for this complaint-oriented system. Tolerant containment, by Gong recently, interesting sociological work from the American Sociological Association. He looked at the role of social housing tenants and how these community-based teams look at, or basically neutralize public nuisance in social housing buildings by medicating and giving them sequestered housing, to reduce complaints from neighbors. And then increasingly so, and I'm sure we're all aware of this, is the increased reliance on faith-based care or nonprofit care, where nonprofit agencies and religious groups are basically providing services to the poor in order to fill some of the underfunded public services. So they're kind of filling the gaps, if you will, of an underfunded public sector by providing basic necessities like nourishment and basic resources for the poor. So there's this sort of interesting work evolving in poverty governance. However, as I'm arguing here, all of this is focused on state and nonprofit sectors, and there really isn't a focus on the role private industries or the private sector has in poverty governance, and I think there should be, given the emergence of these new forms of social control that I noted earlier, and we'll talk about in more detail right now. So there has been some work that has documented the cases of these more supportive, seemingly supportive BIAs in Washington, Los Angeles, and Seattle. However, they basically just acknowledge that this exists, and they don't necessarily look at the logics, the rationales, the justifications for these models. And it's very atheoretical. It was just more of a case study looking and acknowledging that BIAs in these cities, or some BIAs at least, are working with local social services, so on and so forth. So there isn't really this in-depth examination. So hence I want to look at these 2 particular BIAs, again, as I noted, the Safe Inclusive Street Strategy and the Downtown Community Safety Partnership in Winnipeg. So as I said, the Toronto's boundary, so here, anyone familiar with Toronto, you have Dundas Square here, the sort of mega center, one of arguably Canada's biggest consumption space, outdoor consumption space, right here in the middle of this boundary. And the boundary goes all the way up to Alexander Street to the north, Richmond Street to the south, Bay Street to the west, and basically Yonge Street is the main eastern artery, but there are some businesses here as well that are encompassed in that boundary. So this is a large boundary, so this is the biggest BIA in Canada, the most biggest, I think geographically largest and most affluent, to be sure. And they do offer these new programs under their Safe and Inclusive Street Strategy, where they do these partnered outreach with Aboriginal elders, what they're coining the walkabout. They're also partnering not just with regular patrol officers, but specially trained officers through their mobile crisis intervention team. So they're specially trained on dealing with de-escalation during mental health crisis calls. And they also partner with nurses. These police officers, I should say, partner with mental health nurses as well to attend these calls. So again, the BIA partners with this group. They give this mental health workshops to businesses in the area. So they partnered with the Canadian Mental Health Association to give these sorts of workshops to teach businesses on de-escalation tactics and the complexities of structural causes of homelessness and that sort of stuff. They have these drop-in booklets, which I'll talk about in just a second. And the interesting development, which I might want to look for in more detail, are the emergence of these community engagement teams, which I find is very interesting because it's basically offloading policing tasks to these volunteers. So I basically gathered this through publicly accessible data from just Googling the name of this strategy, and then apparently they were presenting this to like a BIA conference where they won some award. But in any case, these are some of the slides that I found interesting. So here's the walkabout. So they partner with Aboriginal elders, and they walk on the streets and engage with street-involved Aboriginal adults. So again, it's this interesting partnership with the police. Again, these community engagement teams, which I find very interesting, it's these two-person outreach teams that are responding to calls and complaints from businesses, 8 hours a day, 7 days a week. And the interesting aspect of this is that they are claiming to divert what would be 911 calls or non-emergency calls. So again, sort of the offloading mechanism to community teams in this case. Yeah, so they do about 50 calls a month. They participate with the Toronto Police on these patrols, and sometimes with other agencies like housing workers, outreach workers, nurses, elders, etc. Some other programs they do is this drop-in resource booklet. So they basically, the BIA produces and distributes these booklets to businesses, and it gives them advice on how to de-escalate situations, and also gives a list of local social services that people can avail of themselves from locally. So these kind of booklets are just produced and given out to local merchants. And then again, those workshops I mentioned, collaborating with the Canadian Mental Health Association, these bi-monthly workshops in order to understand de-escalation methods and the complexities around mental health issues. So a lot more detail about Toronto's approach. Winnipeg's approach is fairly new, this downtown community partnership. Less is known about this, so this is the only information I could really gather from them based on publicly accessible data. But again, the boundary here is this downtown space. I think it includes the Exchange District. I've actually never been to Winnipeg, so I don't know the area very well. But I do hear it's cold, so I don't know if I want to be doing my data in the winter terms. But in any case, this is the boundary it encompasses, and they do have what they're coining this MAC 24/7 outreach team, which provides social assessments, social needs assessments, and first aid and to non-emergency situations. They also, interestingly different from the Toronto approach, have these outreach caseworkers that do follow-up intervention. So they kind of have this other mechanism where they follow up with the people that they meet on the streets. Again, not too much information about Winnipeg's approach other than what's on their BIA website, but it has garnered some media attention in recent years. So yeah, just basically distributing naloxone, administering it, and again, these are very new articles from this year, October, July. So it's getting some media attention. It might be a bit unconventional to show a video during a talk, but I do want to just show a quick snippet of a CBC, I already preloaded it, of a CBC portrayal of this very recently, so you get a good sense of why they're doing this and what they're doing.
With money from the province last year, the Downtown Community Safety Partnership was able to set up what could $5 million give you? A lot. And the ability to save lives, according to advocates working with vulnerable people. With money from the province last year, the Downtown Community Safety Partnership was able to set up 3 outreach teams to patrol the streets of downtown Winnipeg.
But I'm seeing some of the most impressive work I've seen in my years. Literally out there saving lives, helping people.
Last June, the province announced $5 million to the Downtown Community Safety Partnership. The goal was to have more community patrollers to make downtown safer and alleviate the pressure of calls for law enforcement. The announcement came after the death of George Floyd and calls to defund the police. Since then, outreach teams from DCSP have done more than 2,000 wellness checks, and one of the teams is now available 24/7.
I want to honor our young people that are out there every day. When you see this color, when you see that, you honk, you wave, you give a thumbs up, because they're out there 24/7 and they are literally saving lives.
The program models after community groups already doing the work, such as Bear Clan, Mama Bear Clan, OPK, and Drag the Red. The $5 million also allowed the team to set up a website and launch an app. The money is expected to last a few more years, but the province didn't say whether it will fund it further after that.
Well, we're hoping that the funding won't run out, because we're hoping that through our efforts and our collaborations, we're going to be able to describe this sufficiently so that our federal partners see the value in this, and all continue to advocate within government.
Despite the uncertainty, advocates are still thrilled that they're making a difference.
We're here as hosts, we're here as safety, we are here as support workers, we are here as navigators.
Peggy Lamb, CBC News, Winnipeg.
So yeah, as you see, it's being very much touted as this big radical change in how the city is managing visible poverty. And significant because they are receiving, again, $5 million from the government to continue running this program and its offerings. And interesting too that it's framed within the larger defund the police movement, that this is an example of less reliance on police resources and more reliance on these outreach teams. So a lot to unpack there in terms of my research. But very quickly, I just want to talk about what I plan to do with this research, what my objectives are. Clearly, I need to first identify some of the core characteristics and the operations of these business-led poverty governance models. What do they do? What programs do they offer? I have a basic sense of it based on what I described today, but I definitely need to learn more. Secondly, sort of to keep continuing on with my emphasis and interest in understanding the justifications of these types of models, I want to understand the motivations and justifications of those that are involved in these programs. So specifically, the BIA board members, the outreach workers, even the police agencies that are involved in this. I also thirdly want to look at how these business-led poverty governance models interact with existing state and nonprofit models that exist in the city. What are the relationships like? Are they, so pro-social? Is there sort of hostile, tense relationships between the business, the BIA, and the local social services, shelters, etc.? From a more theoretical lens, I wanted to look at how businesses are actually mixing profit-making with their philanthropic endeavors. So this is an interesting sort of, compromise between sort of civil duties, but at the same time, it's still a business improvement area. They're still looking to, increase business activity, consumers, investment, etc. So how do they sort of compromise those two theoretical standpoints, if you will? Then lastly, I do want to evaluate the efficacy of these programs. What are the implications on the people on the streets? Is it actually helping them? What are basically the implications, and how can we evaluate this program? In terms of methodology, I'm still trying to work through what I'm going to actually do, but definitely interviews with various local stakeholders here in both cities, from the top level right to the bottom. So the BIA board of directors that enacted this change, to the business property owners that are within that BIA boundary, the outreach workers, the various outreach workers that I mentioned, even the police officers that are involved in these programs. And I do want to do some participant observations of these outreach workers' day-to-day activities, their day-to-day routines, in order to really get a good understanding of how they problem solve, interact with people on the street, and see sort of the way they enact and treat people. And also, which I already have begun, is do a document analysis of some of the BIA promotional materials on their programs, specifically in order to see how the rhetoric of it is promoted in the media discourse, and whether that matches up with what's actually happening on the ground. But it'll be interesting to do a comparison there. So really just to conclude, again, I'm very interested in understanding these logics of this new business-led poverty governance model here. We're seeing sort of more and more of these businesses using and relying on these sorts of new innovative strategies to manage visible poverty. And I think there's a need to examine and evaluate these programs to see what the actual governance logic is here. What is the logic of it? How does it operate? And there's just some things that I continue to think about and try to connect to this, to what I'm looking at here is, to what extent do these models continue to retain some neoliberal qualities? So for instance, I mean, simply connecting people experiencing homelessness to shelter systems doesn't necessarily entirely mean it's a supportive, caring approach. There's been a lot of critical work suggesting that the shelter systems itself and some of the mental health services offered there are just another example of a neoliberal approach that individualizes homelessness to a mental illness, and that it encourages people experiencing homelessness to govern themselves out of it. So are we still seeing sort of this reliance on neoliberal qualities in a different way? Still yet to be determined. Does it reflect ethical capitalism? So this body of work, I'm less familiar with, but my colleague who's working with me on this, Zachary Hyde from the University of Toronto, he's kind of bringing this lens into it, but to what extent can we apply these ideas of ethical capitalism, this sort of corporate social responsibility, to BIAs? How are they compromising their market motives with these sorts of ethical civic duties that they see themselves, at least touting it through the media discourse? To what extent is it actually relieving the burden on the police, and more specifically, what are the implications by offloading these tasks to community outreach workers and so on? So there's a lot to unpack there, especially around the context of justifying it with the defund the police movement. And if these are positive models here, should we and can we translate these to other locations? So this is me thinking within sort of a policy mobilities framework to see, can this be applied to smaller mid-sized cities? Can and should it? Still yet to be determined. And lastly, I do want to just finish by saying I'm not suggesting that this is a panacea for solving homelessness by any means. Solving homelessness requires larger discussions around structural solutions to homelessness, to be sure. I mean, we need to provide affordable housing, solve unemployment, address systemic racism, gender-based discrimination, figure out dysfunctions within the foster care system, transitional support from hospitals and prisons. By no means is this the be-all, end-all silver bullet for homelessness, but as these approaches continue to receive government funding, I think it's important to assess and evaluate these models and how they function. And it could be a promising trend moving away from that punitive approach that I highlighted to a more supportive approach potentially. So just wanted to end that final thought. So looking forward to any questions, comments that you have, and thank you for listening.
So you're playing counter.
Thank you so much for that talk. I was thinking, you showed the picture of Pigeon Restaurant in Vancouver.
Which one?
It's called Pigeon, P-I-G-E-N, way back in the beginning. And it made me, like, I was reminded that when I was first teaching at UBC, I had a student who was doing an ethnography of Pigeon Restaurant. So Pigeon Restaurant, like, it opens right in the heart of the Sunnyside. And he did this ethnography where he watched people drive up in $100,000 cars. Pigeon was about poverty tourism, no doubt, right? So I think it's interesting that now, like 10 years later, people who are owning businesses like Pigeon are realizing that maybe that model doesn't work. So I wonder, like, what, how you can think about the role of consumers and middle class and upper class consumers, and their choices into this project. I think it's super interesting. Like, Pigeon was never about clean and safe. It was always about, like, the danger.
Yeah, and actually, I think I know the work you're talking about. I don't know if it's the same scholar, but I think I read work by Burnett, I want to say is the last name, and he was using this term, poverty tourism, in Vancouver, arguing that these BIAs are, like, promoting the fact that we come to the street, sit in front of our cafe, and see, the urban disorder in Gastown and downtown East Side, and this became sort of a commodified way of showing the true authenticity of downtown struggles. Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah, but very much so it's like a different process now, right? Is that these BIAs aren't commodifying it, but trying to solve it now, maybe? Yeah.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, we'll take one more question here, and then we have an online question.
Can you go to your slide of methodology?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Interviews with various local actors. I wonder what the connection between interviewing board of directors, property owners, outreach workers, police officers. Is there kind of a hierarchy in the kind of interview schedule you're having? And one sets of answers or ideas flows into the next one, or is this alphabetically ordered? Seems alphabetical.
I guess when I making the list, it was almost in a hierarchy, I guess, in a way, because I mean, in one sense, the BIA board of directors, you know, has the power to decide to use this strategy, and it goes all the way down to the street workers at the bottom. But yeah, I guess I'm kind of theorizing it in a hierarchical sense in the way it's labeled and categorized here. But I think it would be interesting to see, you know, the different perceptions of this policy amongst these various local actors, because what you do hear from directors, you know, it's usually just suits that are, you know, the partners at law firms or partners at large accounting firms. Why do they want to use this strategy, all the way down to, you know, the outreach workers that are actually doing the on-the-ground work. So I think there's something to be said about, you know, comparing the two. And I don't have, you know, people experiencing homelessness on this list, because at first, the first stage of this project, I think, should be to understand the logic of it. And I think as a secondary project in the future, I do want to look at the implications from the standpoint of those on the streets. So yeah, there's still more to unpack there, I think, too. But yeah, I mean, back to your question, I think I'd get different perceptions and different viewpoints amongst this kind of hierarchy. Yeah.
Oh yeah, so we have a question online. It's from Arn, and he says, "Thanks for your talk, Daniel. I appreciate the effort to nuance the analysis of these programs. But given the proponents, aren't these efforts mainly aimed at, quote, de-risking the urban growth machine?"
So I'm not exactly sure what it means by de-risking the urban growth machine, but and I'd like to hear more about that. But yeah, I mean, early on, a lot of the BIAs were framed within, you know, the urban growth machine, you know, framing them within, like I said, the punitive term, neoliberal term. But yeah, I'm still trying to really pinpoint the way I'm theorizing, conceptualizing the role of neoliberalism here. I think that's really something I continue to struggle with, is that, you know, is this a subtle difference? Is this a resistance to these punitive policies that have been traditionally employed? So yeah, I continue to always struggle with how do we frame this. So I don't know if that answers Arn's question, but I'd be very much interested in hearing sort of a definition of the de-risking, because I haven't heard that before.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Ratna and then Julia.
Thank you for that. I enjoyed learning about these because I'm not familiar with the topic, but from the governance perspective, and we have poverty in like private fisheries and even similar thing, moving from the state-led governance model to a more collaborative model. And I'm glad you mentioned that we are interested in looking at also from the perspective of, I would call the poverty experts, which are the people who are affected by that. So I'm not sure the extent to which this BIA is structured in terms of a more collaborative approach. I don't know whether there is any process of engaging with people who are really affected by this and really kind of part of the in this case, that you can also involve in the governance to really make the space work for them. Because when I hear this program in Toronto and Winnipeg, they're both using the word safe and safety. But you can imagine that safety for the homelessness would look quite different from the safety for the affluent residents of the city.
Yeah, and that's a great point, something that I didn't mention, but yeah, that is a lingering question, is, yeah, these are coined as safe and inclusive, but yeah, the question is for who, right? What actors? I'm sure at some point from the data collection, I might try to unpack that sort of safety for who, right? Because usually it's the standpoint of, maybe to Art's question, sort of the middle class, safety for the middle class to continue with their safe consumption activities. But they're claiming here that it's interesting that we use the word safe, right? Yeah, safety for who, because they are emphasizing that collaborative approach. So yeah, there's something to unpack with even just the title of and the names given to these programs for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. It was very interesting. I wanted to go back to the last one. You don't have to go through slides. But
Oh,
your
that's
last
okay.
one, your concluding thoughts. And you talk about obviously homelessness requiring structural solutions, and this, I mean, and you mentioned the word offloading several times, which is very poignant because of course the sort of responsibility for managing the housing crisis is being offloaded to poverty governance models. And I'm more familiar, of course, with the way that the housing crisis and managing it has been offloaded onto the nonprofit sector. But here, of course, your businesses then coming in and also playing a part in that. And I would say the police too are very much at the quote unquote front line of managing the housing crisis. And so I'm just wondering how, and also going back to your methodology, how you'll account for the role of housing, the context of the housing crisis, of the lack of affordable, accessible housing. Because ultimately, these, as successful as these approaches are, they are in a sense a mandate solution. They're covering up for the reality that there are a growing number of people without access to housing, without access to adequate social support. So I see sort of a need for an illumination of the housing contexts in Toronto and Winnipeg, and sort of the greater federal policy around housing that plays a role here. It'd be really interesting to hear from the people that you're talking to how they see housing connecting. And then the other part too is just the police. I've seen many examples across Canada where you have police forces who make a decision to stop basically investing their time and energy in handling the the symptoms of homelessness, or rather the kind of the visible signs of issues on the street, as a way of forcing pressure on the state to actually address the housing crisis. But then what happens is that the non-profit sector and the business sector then come in and have to kind of deal with the outcomes of that because the state isn't getting involved.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, the housing piece I think is really important here. And yeah, I don't know, because in my preliminary sort of the publicly accessible data, housing isn't really mentioned. So that is interesting, but I think going back to some of my more recent work on, I briefly mentioned about BIA's lobby against affordable housing. That's what I found in the London example. It'll be interesting to see to what extent, and this speaks to the methodology question maybe even too, to what extent these board of directors and the leaders of these organizations, to what extent do they go to city council to lobby for affordable housing? Is this happening in the background of city council deliberations? That's where the answer to that question might come, because I think that's maybe the minor role these private industry or the BIAs can play is, advocating for it, saying, we see what's happening on the streets, we need the structural solution. So yeah, the answer to that question might come from, are they lobbying for it? Are they supporting it in the background? Because yeah, very much so, I agree. This is a Band-Aid solution. It's just kind of dealing with the symptom of it. The minor sub-point is that at least they're no longer criminalizing it and displacing it seemingly. But yeah, the structural solution is sort of the big question, right? Is to what extent is that contributing to the structural solution? I don't know. But yeah, what's happening in the background I think is very important in terms of whether they're lobbying or not. I don't know if that answers your question, but
absolutely. I mean, I'm concerned too about the vulnerability of people, the clients who are being served here, because even when you have great examples of innovative partnerships, if they don't receive sustained funding, then what? I mean, and we see that time and again. These great approaches are being developed through interagency committees or through business and not-for-profit partnerships, but then as you showed in your video, you're saying, well, we hope that this funding continues. Of course, if the funding doesn't, then what replaces that? And again, the housing crisis persists.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting. Really interesting.
Yeah, and that's something I've been increasingly thinking about too, is how does the housing piece connect, especially in a city like Toronto, where condo developments and sort of condominification in the city has been exacerbated. But yeah, the housing piece is something that kind of lingers at the back of my head, and how would BIAs fit in? But yeah, that's a good point.
I have one really quick question. Have you ever thought about doing this? I see that you're focused on urban homelessness, but have you ever thought about rural, like a rural case study? Because like I know in the town I used to live, we didn't even have enough money for a police officer. So like, when something happened, there was no one you could call. And like having a community outreach, it seems like it would be like actually a really good thing in those communities.
Yeah, no, so I haven't. So quick answer is no, I haven't thought about the sort of the rural aspect of it. And I know you do a lot of that work in the north. But yeah, there's some interesting questions to see how and if rural communities, if these can be employed there, or the extent to which these outreach teams can function there. Yeah, I don't have necessarily an answer to that, but yeah, it's my emphasis has very much been on sort of the urban form. But even I am seeing some of these in smaller rural towns popping up. So by no means is Brantford a small town, but there's some cities in and around Brantford too that are using this sort of strategy with very small downtowns, like Woodstock, for instance, which is a city of about 50,000, but so maybe not necessarily huge rural, but I don't know. I haven't thought about that. Yeah.
Sorry, today is actually not Friday, I just know, right? Because it follows a different schedule, so we have to get out of here.
Oh, okay.
Oh, it doesn't